6 elderly women and cornered my teenage daughter at a farmer's market, calling her a sinner, a bad sister, and even an unchristian disgrace. And when I found out who sent them, let's just say, I made sure my ex-mother-in-law would never show her face in church again. If you have ever dreamed of giving people exactly the karma they deserve, hit that like button right now, because today's story is about betrayal, manipulation, and a revenge so satisfying, it left an entire church speechless. I'm a 46-year-old mom with 2 teenage daughters, 17 and 15. Last year, my world fell apart. My husband died in an accident, but that wasn't even the worst part. Before his death, I discovered he'd been cheating on me, and he had 2 children with his affair partner. When my daughters found out, it broke them. They were the ones who uncovered the affair. They carried that guilt. They even went to therapy because of it. And to make it worse, after my husband's death, his parents, their grandparents, turned on us. Instead of supporting my girls, they demanded custody of them. They even tried to move into our house, as if they could replace their son's presence. We're still in court fighting them, and through it all, they've treated my daughters with cruelty and judgment, blaming them for things no child should ever carry. The market incident. One Saturday, I decided to give my youngest daughter something special for her birthday. We went to our local weekend farmer's market, one of those charming places with fresh eggs, bread, and chocolate stalls. I gave her a budget and let her buy whatever she wanted. But after an hour, my phone rang. It was her. She was sobbing. "Mom, please help. Some women won't let me leave." My heart dropped. I ran with my older daughter and found 6 elderly women surrounding my crying child. They were berating her, calling her unchristian for not spending time with her grandparents and for refusing to be a good sister to her father's affair children. Imagine that. Grown adults attacking a 15-year-old girl. I stepped between them and told my older daughter, "Take your sister, pay for her things, and go to the car." Then I turned to face those vultures. And yes, I knew some of them. They were members of my ex-in-law's church. They hissed at me that I was a bad wife, that I should have obeyed my in-laws, that my daughters owed them loyalty. The shouting got so heated, we were asked to leave the market. As I walked away, those women actually followed me like vultures circling prey. That night, after tucking my girls into bed, I was shaking with anger. How dare anyone, let alone at church, attack my kids? Reached out to a friend from that same church, someone I trusted, and he told me the truth. My ex-mill had posted this huge sob story in the church Facebook group. She claimed my daughters and I had abandoned her and her husband. She said we'd taken all the money from my late husband's accounts and life insurance, leaving them destitute. She even lied that the 2 children from the affair were surrogates, that I refused them because they were boys. The part that nearly made me vomit. She painted herself as a poor, helpless widow, and me as the heartless woman who destroyed her family. And the church rallied around her. But here's the kicker. That church is strict, brutally strict, about cheating. Affairs are a huge no-no, and my MIL conveniently left that part out of her little sob story. That was my moment of resolve. Enough was enough. She wanted to use her church as a weapon? Fine. I'd use her church as her downfall. I still had all the evidence from my divorce, photos, texts, emails, proof of my husband's affair, proof that my in-laws knew about it and even supported it, proof of their harassment toward my daughters, where they even called them bastards and blamed them for their father's death. I gathered every shred of it. The next day, I went to a print shop. Not only did I print everything, I paid for high-quality glossy copies. Then I made personalized binders, each one looking exactly like the hymn booklets the church hands out on Sundays. When you opened them, the very first page was a crystal-clear photo of my husband making out with his mistress on our living room couch. Underneath it read, ex-husband's name and mistress's name, a love story. Page after page documented the lies, the texts, the emails, the verbal abuse toward my daughters. It was undeniable. On Sunday morning, I slipped those binders onto the church's back desk, right where people pick up hymn packets, and then I left. The gossip exploded. The church's Facebook page turned into chaos. People were furious, calling my ex a liar, calling his mistress worse. My in-laws, they were humiliated, exposed. The pastor himself had to step in to keep the language from getting too vulgar. And while some people still judge me for filing for divorce, others finally saw the truth. A few even sent apology letters to my daughters, letters of compassion they should have received from their own grandparents. But my ex-in-laws, they were shamed out of the church, completely alienated. My ex-mill went on her personal Facebook to whine about being abandoned and how no one cares for the elderly anymore. She even said she wished her wonderful son was still alive to take care of her. What money she thought he would have used, I'll never know. Because I was the breadwinner, always had been. So in the end, the same church community my ex-meal weaponized against us turned its back on her, all because she couldn't keep her lies straight. And the best part? I didn't even have to raise my voice. All I did was hand them the truth, bound neatly in hymn-like binders. She wanted to shame my daughters. Instead, she ended up shamed by the very people she thought she controlled. Revenge doesn't always come from lies, tricks, or violence. Sometimes the sweetest revenge comes from exposing the truth. And when people finally see someone for who they really are, it hits harder than anything else. If this story gave you chills, smash that like button and tell me in the comments, what's the most satisfying revenge you've ever seen? And of course, don't forget to subscribe for more stories where justice gets served in the most unexpected ways. And then the church itself turned into a wildfire of whispers, like someone had tossed a lit match into a field of dry grass. People were craning their necks, leaning into each other's ears, gasping as the glossy photos made their rounds. Shock spread across the pews in waves. Did you see this one? That's clearly their living room. How could she ever spin this as a surrogate? One woman muttered with disgust. Another man shook his head, his voice low but sharp. He lived a double life, lied to all of us, and his parents helped him cover it up. Later, a friend told me it was like the entire congregation was waking up from a 20-year spell of blind devotion, forced to question everything they thought they knew about my ex-in-laws and their so-called perfect family. My former mother-in-law sat rigid, her lips trembling as color drained from her face. My father-in-law just stared at the floor, hands clenched so tightly his knuckles looked bone-white. And then, like the shriek of a wounded animal, my ex-mill broke the silence. This is all lies. Fabricated. She made this up, she screamed, her voice echoing against the vaulted ceiling. But the problem for her was simple. The evidence was undeniable. Crystal clear photographs of my ex tangled up with his mistress, time-stamped text threads dripping with guilt, and the harshest blow of all, the printed messages where they bullied my daughters and called them names that made even the pastor shift uncomfortably in his seat. One of the older women in the congregation, the same kind who once nodded along to my ex-Miles sob stories, suddenly stood up and read aloud one of the worst lines. "It's your fault your father's dead, you selfish brats." The words echoed through the sanctuary, and the silence that followed was suffocating. People's jaws dropped. Some gasped audibly, and others shook their heads with fury. That was the moment the tide turned. The sympathy my in-laws had milked from the congregation evaporated in an instant. The same church members who had once defended them now stared with narrowed eyes, disgust painted across their faces. And in that moment, sitting quietly in the back, my heart finally slowed. For the first time in years, I felt a strange, intoxicating peace. This wasn't petty revenge. This was justice. The truth, in all its brutal clarity, had finally done what no courtroom or custody battle ever could. It stripped my ex-in-laws of their mask and forced them to face the very community they'd manipulated for so long. The pastor finally rose from his seat, his face grave, his voice calm, but cutting through the tension like a blade. "This is not fabricated. These materials speak for themselves," he said, holding up one of the binders. "And if even half of this is true, then a grave sin has been committed here, not by these daughters, but by those who should have been their protectors." My ex-mill's face contorted, her lips quivering as she tried to interject, but the pastor raised a hand, and the congregation fell back into silence. That was the final blow. The one person she thought would always back her was now openly questioning her. A ripple of murmurs followed, people shaking their heads, others whispering prayers under their breath, But none of it was for her anymore. After the service ended, I didn't even need to linger. Word spread faster than wildfire through the church's Facebook group, through text chains, even whispered phone calls that night. By the next morning, my phone buzzed with messages from parents of kids who once looked up to my ex as a role model. "We had no idea," one wrote. "I am so sorry your daughters went through this." Another said, "Your girls deserve better than this community gave them. We failed them. I hope you can forgive us." For the first time in months, my girls opened letters addressed to them that didn't drip with venom, but instead carried words of kindness, compassion, and apology. They cried when they read them, but these were healing tears, not the bitter, choking sobs they used to fight at night. And as for my ex-in-laws, their world crumbled overnight. The same church ladies who once marched to the farmer's market to shame my daughter now avoided my MIL like she carried the plague. She would shuffle into services, only to find empty pews around her, whispers chasing her steps, and doors closing before she could join the conversation she once dominated. Her Facebook wall turned into a pitiful diary of self-pity. No one cares for the elderly anymore. My great son is gone, and now the world has abandoned me. But her words rang hollow, especially when everyone knew the truth, that she and her husband had covered up his betrayal, protected his lies, and spat their cruelty at the very grandchildren they pretended to love. Eventually they stopped attending altogether. Too much shame, too many eyes watching, too many whispers trailing behind them. And me? I never had to raise my voice again. I never had to lift another finger. I simply let the truth sit in neat, glossy binders, hymn-like and undeniable. The revenge was complete, but more than that, it was cleansing. For my daughters, for myself, and for the family we were trying to rebuild out of the ashes of betrayal. Because sometimes, the sweetest revenge isn't in destroying someone, it's in letting their own lives burn them alive when the truth finally comes into the light. In the weeks that followed, the fallout only grew worse for my ex-in-laws. They had lived their entire lives inside that church bubble, feeding off the admiration and respect of people who thought they were the perfect Christian grandparents, pillars of morality and sacrifice. But now, that same community looked at them like frauds, hypocrites who would use God's name as a mask to hide behind while spreading venom. The invitations to dinners, Bible studies, charity events, gone. Neighbors who once waved to them in the street now crossed to the other side, whispering to each other instead of stopping for small talk. And the irony was delicious. They had wanted to weaponize that same community against my daughters, to shame two innocent teenage girls into compliance. Instead, they had been shamed right out of their social world. The letters to my daughters kept arriving, some from people we barely knew, others from people who admitted that they had believed the lies at first but now saw the truth. One woman wrote, "I judged you unfairly. I thought you were turning away from your grandparents out of selfishness, but I see now it was protection. No child should be forced to carry a parent's sins." My daughters kept those letters tucked into a box, their first real proof that not everyone was against them. At night, when they sat together in their rooms, I would hear them reading those letters out loud to each other, laughing sometimes at the over-the-top apologies, crying softly when the words struck too close to their wounds. Slowly, I watched their shoulders relax, their eyes soften, like the heavy weight they had carried since their father's death was finally starting to lift. My ex-mother-in-law, on the other hand, could not accept her downfall. She raged online, posting cryptic statuses about betrayal, about being cast aside, about how the younger generation had no respect for elders. But every comment she left was met with silence, or worse, with people reminding her of the very evidence she wanted to erase. "Respect is earned, not demanded," one woman shot back, "and you lost it the moment you made those girls feel less than human." It wasn't just online either. Word traveled outside the church into the town itself, and suddenly, the couple who once held court at the farmer's market, who always demanded front-row attention, found themselves isolated. The farmers they once chatted with now served them in icy silence. The neighbors who once invited them to birthday parties now forgot to extend the invitation. And I didn't have to do a thing. I lived my life, cared for my daughters, and let their lies eat them alive. The real beauty of it all was how natural the justice felt. I didn't invent anything. I didn't exaggerate or smear. I just put the truth in their own hands and let them read it for themselves. And that truth had more power than any revenge plot I could have cooked up. My daughters learned something too. They saw that you don't always need to fight fire with fire. Sometimes you fight it with a mirror. And when liars are forced to stare at their own reflection, it destroys them far more than any angry outburst ever could. Months passed, and eventually, my ex-in-laws stopped going to church altogether. Rumor had it they tried, attending a different congregation in the next town over, but the gossip had already spread. People knew. They weren't just ashamed in one community, they were branded everywhere. Their own reputation had followed them, like a scarlet letter they couldn't scrub clean. And while part of me felt a flicker of pity for two elderly people cut off from the only social life they had ever known, I reminded myself of the truth. They had no pity for my daughters. They had cornered children, shamed them, blamed them for their father's death. Whatever loneliness they felt now, they had earned it 10 times over. Justice, I realized, doesn't always come fast. Sometimes it takes patience. Sometimes it takes enduring humiliation and heartbreak. But when it comes, when the truth finally erupts into the light, it is sweeter, heavier, and more permanent than anything else. And as I watched my daughters rebuild their lives, I knew one thing for sure. The best revenge was never about hurting my ex-in-laws. The best revenge was about protecting my girls, healing their wounds, and letting the people who once doubted us finally see what we endured. That revenge wasn't just sweet, it was righteous. A year later, the storm hadn't died down. It had simply settled into something permanent. My ex-in-laws never recovered from the blow. They withdrew almost completely, shuffling quietly between their house and the grocery store, their heads down, no longer the loud, self-important figures who once strutted around as if the entire town owed them respect. Their social circle had collapsed to nothing, just a handful of bitter acquaintances who pitied them, not admired them. And even those people didn't stay long, because the bitterness in my ex-Mill's voice poisoned every conversation. She couldn't stop ranting about betrayal, about how everyone had turned against her, about how her son would have never allowed this if he were still alive. But people weren't buying it anymore. They had seen the evidence, read the words she had spewed at my daughters, and they weren't about to let her rewrite history to suit her pride. Meanwhile, my girls were thriving. Therapy sessions were still hard, but they began opening up in ways I hadn't seen since before the affair was revealed. My eldest started writing, journals full of her feelings, turning her pain into stories of strength. My youngest took up painting, pouring her emotions onto canvas, transforming what once was sorrow into something alive and beautiful. They had both learned that they weren't defined by their father's betrayal or their grandparents' cruelty. They were defined by how they survived it. And one evening, as we sat around the dinner table, my youngest looked up at me with clear, steady eyes and said, "Mom, I don't feel scared of them anymore." That was the moment I knew the revenge had done its job. Not because my ex-in-laws had been humiliated, though they had, but because my daughters no longer felt the crushing weight of their lies. The church never fully forgot either. Even months later, when new people visited, whispers still circled back to that Sunday when the glossy binders appeared, when the masks were ripped away. It became a story the community told, almost like a cautionary tale. Don't lie, don't manipulate, because eventually the truth finds you. My ex-mother-in-law tried one last desperate move. She wrote a letter to the court during the custody battle, begging for guardianship over my daughters, claiming I was poisoning them against their heritage. But by then, the judge had already seen the evidence, already knew who had truly poisoned what. The letter was dismissed almost immediately, and if anything, it only solidified the court's view that they were unfit to be around my daughters at all. Walking out of that courtroom, I felt a wave of relief so powerful, I almost cried right there in front of everyone. My girls were safe. Safe from the manipulation, safe from the cruelty, safe from being used as pawns in someone else's sick game. And as we drove home, windows down, music blasting, I glanced at them in the rearview mirror, smiling, laughing, light in their eyes again. That was the real victory. My revenge wasn't just about exposing my ex-in-laws to the church. It was about reclaiming our lives, piece by piece, until the shadow of their lies no longer touched us. The truth had burned them, but it had freed us. And sometimes, that's the greatest justice of all. Time has a strange way of making everything clearer. 2 years after that fateful Sunday, my ex-in-laws had become ghosts in their own community. The woman who once barked orders in church kitchens, who thrived on whispering gossip in parking lots, now barely left her front porch. Her yard, once obsessively maintained, grew wild and unkempt. Weeds curling over the walkway like nature itself was reclaiming what she had lost. Sometimes, neighbors said they could hear her shouting late at night, arguments with my ex-FIL echoing. Through thin walls, the sound of a bitter marriage rotting from the inside. They had no friends left to turn to, and the silence of their isolation became their punishment. But on our side of town, life was blossoming again. My eldest had been accepted into a state university, her essays about resilience and truth so powerful that admissions officers left notes praising her courage. My youngest was showcasing her paintings at a local gallery, bright bursts of color that seemed to shout to the world, I survived. I thrived. Every milestone they reached felt like another nail in the coffin of my ex-Mill's lies. Because while she withered, my daughters flourished. There was one day in particular that struck me. We ran into her at the grocery store, me, my girls, and my ex-Mill pushing a near-empty cart. She looked so much smaller than I remembered, hunched over, her once sharp eyes dulled. She froze when she saw us, her lips twitching as if she wanted to say something, maybe an apology, maybe another lie. But my daughters didn't even flinch. They didn't shrink back. They didn't cry. They didn't look to me for reassurance. My eldest simply walked past her head high, while my youngest gave her a glance so steady and unshaken it was almost defiant. In that moment, I realized the power had shifted completely. My ex-Mill had nothing left, not her son, not her reputation, not the control she once had over my girls. All she had was regret, and even that wasn't enough to make her change. The truth had taken everything from her, and it had given everything back to us. Years down the line, people still bring it up. Not in whispers anymore, but in lessons. Teachers, pastors, parents, they talk about what happens when lies are buried and then finally dragged into the light. My daughters sometimes get asked to share their story at youth groups, not as victims, but as survivors. And every time I hear them speak, strong and unapologetic, I know the revenge wasn't just about payback. It was about planting seeds of truth so deep that the lies could never grow back. And that is the kind of justice that lasts, not just for a moment, not just for a season, but for a lifetime. 10 years later, the dust had settled, but the echoes of what happened never truly disappeared. My daughters had grown into women, confident, grounded, and unshaken by the shadows of the past. My eldest graduated with honors and became a social worker, dedicating her life to helping other children navigate broken families, giving them the strength she once had to fight for herself. My youngest pursued art full-time, her work now displayed in exhibitions across the state, her canvases bursting with color and light, each one a defiant refusal to be defined by pain. And every success they had was a reminder of everything my ex-in-laws tried to take away from them, but failed. As for my ex-Mill and Phil, they became little more than whispers in the town's memory. They had isolated themselves so thoroughly that by the time their health began to fail, there was no one left to check on them. The same people who once followed them, who once believed every poisonous word they spread, didn't even notice when their porch lights stayed off for days. When my ex-file passed away, the funeral was almost empty, just a handful of extended relatives and a pastor who spoke in vague platitudes because there was nothing kind left to say. My mother-in-law sat there alone, frail and bitter, her eyes darting across the room as if searching for the respect she once commanded. But it wasn't there. It was gone. The truth had erased it. Years later, when she too passed, my daughters didn't shed a tear. They didn't feel hatred anymore, and they didn't feel grief either. They just felt nothing, and that nothing was powerful, because the hold those people once had over them had vanished completely. The cycle of control, manipulation, and lies had ended with that generation. It didn't carry forward. It didn't poison the future. Sometimes, when we sit together as a family, my daughters will reflect. They'll laugh about how scared they used to be of whispered lies in the church hallway, how heavy those words once felt. And then they'll look at each other, proud of how far they have come, and say the words that make every fight, every late night, every binder of evidence worth it. They don't own our story anymore. We do. Because in the end, revenge wasn't about watching my ex-in-laws burn. It was about making sure my daughters rose from the ashes. And they did. Higher than anyone expected. Stronger than anyone imagined. And that, right there, is the kind of ending no liar can erase. 20 years later, life looked completely different. My daughters were no longer just survivors of a painful past. They had become architects of a brighter future. My eldest, now a mother herself, often told her children stories, not about villains or betrayal, but about resilience, honesty, and the courage to speak the truth, even when the world tries to silence you. Her little girl once asked, "Grandma, why don't we ever see your parents?" My daughter smiled softly, choosing her words with care, and said, "Because family isn't always about blood. It's about love, respect, and trust, and those are the people we keep close." My youngest daughter, still painting, had her work showcased in international galleries. One of her most famous collections was titled Breaking Chains. Each piece was layered with colors that told a story, anger melting into sorrow, sorrow transforming into strength, strength bursting into joy. Viewers didn't know the personal story behind it, but they felt it. And for her, that was enough. Meanwhile, the legacy of my ex-in-laws faded into nothing more than a cautionary tale in the town's memory. Old neighbors would sometimes whisper, "Do you remember how that family tried to twist the truth? And how it all came back to bite them?" Their downfall became folklore, a quiet reminder that cruelty may win the first battle, but it never wins the war. As for me, I learned peace doesn't come the day your enemies fall. It comes when you no longer care whether they rise or fall. Sitting on my porch one summer evening, watching my grandchildren play in the yard, I realized something profound. Revenge had been sweet, yes, but it wasn't the binders or the church scandal that gave me victory. It was this: the laughter of children who would never know the weight of manipulation, the sound of my daughters' voices filled with pride instead of shame, the quiet freedom of knowing that the lies of the past had no power here. Because the ultimate revenge wasn't shaming them in front of their church. The ultimate revenge was living a life so full, so unapologetically joyful, that their cruelty became irrelevant. They tried to define us by betrayal and loss, but we rewrote the story. And now, decades later, the only legacy left standing is ours. Now, as I sit in my own home, the sun casting golden light across the yard, I often think about how far we've come. The memories of those early dark days, the betrayal, the harassment, the whispers in the church feel almost unreal now, like a storm we survived but didn't let drown us. My daughters, grown into strong, compassionate women, are proof that truth and resilience outlast cruelty. They laugh, they create, they love without fear, and they carry no shadows from the past because we refuse to let anyone dictate their worth. Sometimes I imagine my ex-Merle somewhere, alone in her quiet house, realizing that every scheme, every lie, every attempt to manipulate only reinforced the strength she tried to break. She had all the power in the beginning, the church, the gossip, the perceived authority, but it crumbled because it was built on falsehood. And while she struggled with regret, we thrived on integrity and courage. Years later, when I look back on those binders, that moment in the church, and every sleepless night worrying for my daughters, I understand something deeply. Revenge isn't about hate. It's about reclaiming control, about shielding those you love, about letting justice emerge in its purest form. Every decision I made, every step I took, wasn't about punishing them. It was about giving my daughters their childhood back, and in turn their future. Now, with grandchildren running through the yard, with laughter echoing off the walls of our home, I realize that the story has come full circle. The fear, the shame, the injustice, they exist only as lessons, not chains. And that's the ultimate triumph. We didn't just survive, we conquered. Not by spreading lies or sinking to cruelty, but by standing firm, speaking the truth, and nurturing the next generation in love, honesty, and resilience. And as the sun sets, painting the sky with streaks of orange and pink, I know whatever they tried, whatever they schemed, whatever walls they built to contain us, they failed. The only legacy left is ours, our family, our truth, our freedom. And that, in the end, is sweeter than anything vengeance could ever feel like. Even now, I sometimes replay those moments in my mind. The smell of the church, the quiet shuffle of hymnals as people whispered behind their hands, the way my ex-Mill's face twisted in disbelief as she realized the truth had outpaced her lies. I remember gripping my daughter's hands as we left that market that day, their little palms sweaty, their breaths trembling, and feeling a surge of protective love so intense it made my chest ache. That fear, that raw adrenaline, it never truly leaves you, but it transforms. It becomes fuel. Fuel to fight not with anger, but with clarity, with evidence, with unshakable resolve. There were nights after it all had settled when I lay awake, thinking of the binders on the church desk, the images of betrayal and cruelty, the emails and texts that spelled out their manipulation. I wondered if they even realized how utterly powerless they had become, not just socially, but morally, emotionally, spiritually. They had spent decades believing they controlled the narrative, but in the end, the truth didn't just escape their grasp, it crushed their carefully curated world. And as I drifted to sleep, I could almost hear the echo of justice itself, soft, unyielding, inevitable. My daughters, as they grew older, began to understand the subtle power of truth and resilience. They never glorified revenge. They spoke about justice, fairness, and protecting those who cannot protect themselves. I watched them mentor friends, guide cousins, and even counsel younger students, always emphasizing courage over retaliation. But every time they looked at me with that quiet, steady confidence in their eyes, I knew they also understood the satisfaction of seeing the truth shine brighter than lies ever could. Sometimes, in the quiet of our home, I would glance at the empty shelf where the binders once sat. I didn't need them anymore. The evidence had done its work. The people who needed to see it saw it, and the rest of the world simply absorbed the ripple it caused. I didn't relish their shame. I only cherished the protection it gave my daughters. And in that sense, revenge wasn't a moment. It was a lifetime, stretching into every choice, every smile, every confident step my girls took into the world. Even now, years later, when the wind carries the faint scent of summer markets or the faint murmur of a church choir floats past, I feel a quiet, satisfied warmth, not for humiliation, not for anger, but for endurance, for rising above cruelty, for reclaiming life and joy from those who tried to poison it. That feeling, the unshakable knowledge that our family story belongs to us alone, is sweeter than any fleeting triumph, sharper than any retribution. And as I watch my daughters laugh with their children, free from fear, free from the weight of past betrayal, I finally understand the deepest truth of all. The ultimate revenge is living beautifully, honestly, and fully, knowing those who tried to break you cannot touch that happiness, no matter how loudly they protest from the shadows. Even now, on quiet evenings when the sun dips low and the house glows in golden light, I remember the sound of my daughters' small voices at the market, their laughter, their nervous whispers, the way their little hands clutched mine when those women cornered them. I remember the adrenaline pounding in my chest as I ran toward them, the hum of the weekend crowd around us fading into a tense silence. Every detail is etched in my memory. The heat of the sun on my skin, the smell of fresh produce, the sharp edge of fear mixed with determination. That moment wasn't just a turning point. It became a blueprint for everything that followed. Later, when I walked into the church with those binders tucked under my arm, I remember the soft shuffling of hymnals, the low murmur of Sunday greetings, and the subtle tension in the air as I placed them neatly on the desk in the back. The sound of pages turning, gasps and murmurs, the way eyes widened in disbelief, it all played in my mind like a slow-motion scene in a movie. Every whisper, every glance, every realization was amplified by years of suppressed truth finally surfacing. I remember sitting in the back row, heart hammering, breathing shallow, as the pastor intervened, trying to calm the chaos. And I remember my daughters huddled quietly beside me, feeling both afraid and vindicated at the same time. Their courage in that moment, their quiet strength, planted a seed I'd watch blossom for years to come. The binders were not just evidence, they were a shield, a weapon, and ultimately a bridge to reclaiming our lives. As the years passed, every letter of apology my daughters received, every quiet nod of understanding from neighbors or friends, became a reminder that justice isn't always instant. It's persistent. It lingers, it spreads quietly, and it transforms the world in ways that anger never could. I watch my daughters grow into women who are fearless, compassionate, and unshakable. They learn that true power lies not in punishment, but in truth, in courage, and in living fully despite what others try to take away. And the ex-in-laws? They faded into a shadowed memory. Their anger, their manipulation, their desperate attempts at control, all of it became irrelevant in the face of the life we built. Occasionally, I would hear whispers about them, stories of their loneliness, their failed attempts to reclaim respect. But those whispers carried no weight. They were echoes of a past that had no power over us anymore. Now, years later, when I watch my daughters with their own families, laughing freely, creating joy, and carrying forward the lessons of truth and resilience, I feel a profound sense of closure. The binders, the confrontation, the humiliation of liars, they were all milestones on a journey to this moment. The ultimate revenge was never in shame or embarrassment. It was in reclaiming our lives, protecting my daughters, and building a legacy that cannot be touched by deceit. And as the wind drifts softly through the trees outside, carrying faint echoes of laughter, of life moving forward, I know this truth. The only lasting victory is the one that grows quietly, beautifully, and fully in the hearts of those who refuse to be broken. We survived, we healed, we thrived, and that is a revenge more satisfying than any I could have imagined. Sometimes, when I sit alone at night, I replay the market scene in my mind. The smell of fresh bread, the sun beating down, the nervous energy radiating off my daughters as they clutch their little purchases. It all comes rushing back like a vivid movie reel. I can almost hear the sharp, accusatory voices of those women, the way they tried to corner my youngest, their words twisting innocence into shame. My chest still tightens when I remember the fear in my daughter's eyes and the surge of protective fury that drove me forward, heart-hammering, every step fueled by love and anger intertwined. And then the church, the echo of those binders hitting the desk, the rustle of glossy pages, the collective gasp as the truth spilled into the open. I can feel again the hum of disbelief in the pews, the heat rising in my cheeks as eyes turned toward the in-laws, and the subtle satisfaction when even the pastor, a man who always sought calm, could not hide his shock. The evidence spoke louder than anyone could argue, and for once, silence carried more weight than words. I think of my daughters often during these reflections. Their courage then, their quiet resilience became the foundation of everything that followed. I remember holding my eldest hand as she whispered, "Mom, it's okay. We're okay?" And my youngest, trembling but nodding, trusting me to guide her through the storm. Those tiny gestures, simple yet profound, remind me that love can be sharper than anger, stronger than vengeance, and more enduring than fear. As years passed, every apology letter, every whispered recognition from friends and neighbors built a quiet bridge between the pain of the past and the hope of the future. My daughters flourished, not because they sought revenge, but because they were free from it. They turned trauma into strength, sorrow into creativity, fear into confidence, and I, watching from the sidelines, felt a deep, unshakable pride. The ex-in-laws, on the other hand, became almost like ghosts in the background of our lives, shadows of their former selves, unable to touch us, powerless in the face of the life we reclaimed. Now, even decades later, when laughter rings through our home, when grandchildren chase each other in the yard, I feel the weight of those years lift completely. The binders, the confrontation, the humiliation, They served their purpose long ago. What remains is joy, resilience, and the profound knowledge that truth cannot be defeated. We live in the light of that truth, untouchable by lies, untouched by the cruelty that once loomed over us. And in the quiet moments, when I watch my daughters teach their own children about honesty, courage, and integrity, I realize that this is the ultimate victory. Not shame, not revenge, not retribution, but life reclaimed, joy restored, and a legacy of strength that no one can ever take away. That is the true, lasting, deeply satisfying end of this story, a story of justice, resilience, and the unbreakable bonds of family. Even now, years later, I sometimes find myself walking past the church just to see the building that had once been a battlefield of whispers and judgment. The faint scent of old hymnals, polished wood, and candle wax drifts through the air, stirring memories that still feel alive. I can hear, in my mind, the echo of the market that day, the crowd milling, the sun beating down, the panic in my youngest voice as she called me. I feel again the surge of adrenaline, the heat rushing to my face, the electricity of fury and protection that propelled me forward to shield her. That moment, forever etched in memory, became a symbol, not just of a single act of courage, but of a lifetime of standing firm for those who cannot defend themselves. The binders I left in the church remain a silent monument in my mind. Every glossy page, every image, every message of abuse or manipulation was a piece of truth laid bare. I remember the collective gasp, the shock in the pastor's eyes, the whispers that spread faster than wildfire. I remember my daughters sitting quietly beside me, trembling but resolute, absorbing the empowerment of seeing justice begin to unfold. And I remember the ex-in-laws, frozen as the carefully constructed illusions of their lives collapsed in real time, their shock, their rage, their helplessness. It was poetic, slow-burning, and complete. As my daughters grew, the lessons of that day never left them. They learned not vengeance for its own sake, but the power of truth, resilience, and moral courage. The letters they received from people who had once judged them harshly became testaments to their strength, and they tucked each one away carefully, revisiting them in moments of doubt to remember who they really were. They flourished academically, socially, creatively, and emotionally, becoming women who carried no shadows of fear, only light and confidence. The ex-in-laws, meanwhile, faded into obscurity. They were no longer the center of attention in the church or the town. Their isolation grew, their attempts to reassert control failing at every turn. By the time my daughters were adults, the world had moved on, and the echoes of the past served only as reminders of how fragile power is when it's built on lies. Every public humiliation, every whisper of truth, every moment they had tried to manipulate others, the consequences had followed them like a shadow they could not outrun. And through it all, I understood the deepest truth of the story. Revenge is not about shaming others. It's about reclaiming your own life, protecting those you love, and letting the natural consequences of truth unfold. My daughters' laughter, their courage, their successes, each one a monument far taller than any act of punishment I could have administered. They became living proof that cruelty cannot last forever when it meets integrity, and that the bonds of family, love, and resilience are stronger than any lie. Now, when I watch my daughters with their own children, seeing them pass along lessons of honesty, courage, and compassion, I feel the full weight of satisfaction. Not the fleeting rush of revenge, but the enduring, quiet triumph of life, reclaimed and joy restored. The ex-in-laws' names are barely remembered, whispered only as cautionary tales. And in the warmth of our home, filled with laughter, sunlight, and love, I know every step we took, every risk we endured, every binder of truth laid bare, was worth it. Our story belongs only to us, unbroken, unshaken, and forever victorious. Even now, late at night when the house is quiet, I find myself revisiting those moments in my mind. The market, the heat, the nervous chatter of my daughters, the sun on our faces, the sudden shock of seeing those women descend upon them. It all plays like a vivid film reel. I remember the adrenaline flooding my body, my heart pounding as I pushed through the crowd to reach them. The fear in my youngest's eyes, the shaky grip of her hands around mine, it's something I will never forget. That moment was not just about protecting them from strangers. It was the first spark of reclaiming control over life that had been shadowed by lies, betrayal, and manipulation. The binders at the church, the carefully printed pages, the glossy photos, the evidence laid bare, remain a silent triumph in my memory. I can still feel the hush that fell over the room, the way eyes widened, the subtle tremble in voices as the truth spilled forth. I remember my daughter sitting beside me, trembling but resolute, absorbing the satisfaction of witnessing justice unfold without raising a hand in anger, and the ex-in-laws, frozen, humiliated, powerless, were a study in poetic consequence. Their carefully constructed illusions of moral superiority crumbled completely, their reactions echoing with helplessness and rage. As the years passed, the lessons of those moments became cornerstones in my daughter's lives. They learned not revenge for its own sake, but the strength that comes from truth, resilience, and moral courage. Letters of apology from people who had once judged them harshly became treasured reminders of their integrity. They excelled in every aspect of life, academically, socially, creatively, and emotionally, growing into women who carried no shadows from the past, only light, confidence, and compassion. The ex-in-law's legacy, on the other hand, withered completely. Their isolation, both social and emotional, grew as they attempted, and failed, to regain relevance. By the time my daughters were fully grown, the world had moved on, leaving the ex-in-law's bitterness and shame as nothing more than whispers, cautionary tales about the consequences of cruelty and deception. Every attempt they made to manipulate or reassert control had been met with the immovable barrier of truth and resilience. Through all of this, I learned the deepest lesson. True revenge is not about humiliation or punishment. It is about reclaiming your own life, protecting those you love, and allowing justice to manifest naturally. My daughter's laughter, their courage, their achievements, all of these became the ultimate evidence that cruelty cannot endure in the face of integrity. They became living proof that even the deepest wounds can transform into sources of strength, that family and love are far more powerful than lies. Now, decades later, watching my daughters with their own children, seeing them pass down lessons of honesty, resilience, and compassion, I feel a profound satisfaction. The binders, the confrontation, the public humiliation, they were necessary only as stepping stones to this life. Today, our home is filled with laughter, sunlight, and the quiet certainty that we are untouchable by past cruelty. The ex-in-laws' names are all but forgotten, remembered only as a cautionary whisper in a world that now knows the power of truth, courage, and love. And in those quiet, golden evenings, I finally understand. The ultimate victory isn't in revenge. It's in living fully, freely, and joyfully, knowing that those who try to harm you have no hold over the life you've built. The story belongs to us now, unbroken, unshaken, and forever victorious. Even now, when the house is quiet and the evening sun spills warm light across the floor, I sometimes drift back to that day at the market, the chaos, the fear, the way my daughters clutched their little baskets of sweets, unaware of the storm about to hit them. I can still hear the sharp, accusing voices of those women, trying to twist innocence into shame, and feel my own heartbeat spike as I push through the crowd, adrenaline surging, protective instincts screaming at me to act. Every detail, the scent of fresh bread, the rustle of produce crates, the hum of the weekend crowd, remains etched in my memory. That day was more than a confrontation. It was the beginning of reclaiming our lives from the lies, manipulation, and cruelty that had hung over us for years. Then came the church, the moment when the binders were placed on the back desk, quiet but deadly in their impact. I remember the soft rustle of glossy pages, the barely audible gasps, and the subtle shifting of eyes as people absorbed the truth. My daughter sat beside me, hands trembling, yet unbroken, absorbing the shock and quiet triumph. The ex-in-laws froze, their faces pale and rigid, powerless as their carefully maintained illusions disintegrated in real time. Their rage, their disbelief, their attempts to spin the story, it was all irrelevant now. The truth had taken hold, and it was unstoppable. Over the years, my daughters transformed that fear into strength. The lessons they learned about honesty, resilience, and moral courage became guiding principles in every aspect of their lives. Letters of apology from those who had once judged or doubted them were tucked carefully into memory, reminders that integrity always outlasts deceit. They excelled academically, socially, creatively, and emotionally, stepping into the world with confidence and compassion. Fear no longer defined them. Resilience and love did. Meanwhile, my ex-in-laws faded into near oblivion. Their isolation grew as they attempted and failed to regain respect or influence. By the time my daughters were adults, the whispers of the past were faint echoes, cautionary tales reminding the town of the consequences of cruelty, manipulation, and lies. Every attempt they made to assert control or manipulate the narrative was met with immovable truth and quiet resilience. I've come to understand that the ultimate revenge is not humiliation or punishment. It's reclaiming your life, protecting those you love, and allowing justice to unfold naturally. My daughter's laughter, their courage, their achievements, all of it became evidence that cruelty and deception cannot endure when met with integrity, love, and resilience. They are living proof that even the deepest wounds can be transformed into sources of power, that family bonds and courage are stronger than any lie. Now, decades later, when I watch my daughters with their own children, teaching them lessons of honesty, resilience, and compassion, I feel a deep, unshakable satisfaction. The binders, the confrontation, the public humiliation, they served their purpose long ago. Today, our home is filled with laughter, sunlight, and the quiet certainty that the past no longer has any hold over us. The ex-in-laws' names are nearly forgotten, remembered only as cautionary whispers. And in those quiet, golden evenings, I know the ultimate victory is living fully, freely, and joyfully, knowing that those who tried to harm you have no power over the life you've built. The story belongs to us now, unbroken, unshaken, and forever victorious. Sometimes, when the evening breeze drifts through the house and the faint scent of flowers from the garden reaches me, I remember the subtle moments that shaped our victory, the quiet ones, the whispered reassurances to my daughters, the small victories in therapy sessions, the letters they wrote to each other processing pain and healing. Those moments were quieter than the church scandal or the binders, but they were far more powerful. Every smile that returned to my daughters' faces, every laugh that rang free in the living room, every time they stepped into a room without fear of judgment, it was a victory that no humiliation, no public exposure could ever replicate. Now, decades later, I watch my daughters with their own children, teaching them lessons of courage, honesty, and compassion. I feel an unshakable sense of fulfillment. Our home, filled with laughter, sunlight, and warmth, embodies the victory we fought for. The binders, the confrontations, the church scandal, they were mere milestones on a path toward a life reclaimed. The ex-in-laws' names are almost forgotten, their influence erased, while our story, our enduring story of courage, resilience, and ultimate triumph remains vivid, alive, and untouchable. And in those quiet, golden evenings, as my grandchildren's laughter intertwines with the soft rustling of leaves, I realize fully the ultimate revenge was never about punishment. It was about reclaiming life, restoring joy, and leaving a lasting legacy of truth, resilience, and love that will continue across generations. Our story belongs to us now, unbroken, unshaken, and forever victorious. Years had passed, and yet the memories of that chaotic day at the market, the binders at the church, and the ex-in-laws' stunned faces remained vivid in my mind. But what truly endured was not the anger or the drama. It was the life we had rebuilt, the laughter that now filled our home, and the resilience my daughters had grown into. I often watched them interact with one another, sometimes teasing, sometimes supporting, always unbreakable. Every glance, every shared secret, every small act of kindness between them reminded me of how far we had come. Watching my daughters with their own children brought a profound sense of closure. I could see the values we fought to instill: courage, honesty, compassion, being passed to the next generation. I could see their laughter, free from fear or guilt, echoing through the house. I could see the joy of a family finally unshackled from deceit, cruelty, and the shadow of past lies. The ex-in-laws had long since vanished from our lives, their influence completely eradicated. Their names were barely remembered, whispered only as cautionary tales. Meanwhile, our story, our journey through pain, courage, and ultimate triumph, remained vivid, unbroken, and untouchable. Each smile, each hug, each act of familial love was a quiet but powerful testament to truth, resilience, and integrity. In those golden evenings, as the sun dipped low and the wind rustled through the trees, I finally understood something deeply simple, yet infinitely powerful. The ultimate revenge was never about humiliation, punishment, or anger. The ultimate victory was reclaiming our lives, protecting the ones I love most, and creating a legacy of joy, truth, and resilience that would endure for generations. Our story was ours, unshaken, unbroken, and forever victorious. And so, as laughter fills our home, as memories of past pain fade into lessons learned, I smile quietly to myself, knowing that justice had been served, not with vengeance alone, but with life restored, love protected, and a family stronger than ever. Our story ends not with rage, but with triumph, not with humiliation, but with freedom. And in that freedom, we found our ultimate reward: peace, joy, and a legacy that will last far beyond any moment of anger.